to do is talk about Color Efex Pro Color Efex Pro and DxO Photo Lab, and a little bit of raw processing as well for, the next 45 or 50 minutes, I'm thinking. And I've sort of broken this up into some chapters, if you will. The first thing we're going to talk about is setting your raw files up for color effects. There's several different approaches. We'll talk about those. I should probably tell you who I am as well. But before I do that, the other thing that we're going to talk about are some of my favorite filter combinations. And then we're going to talk about creating your own approach as well. I'm in Eric Kunzman's studio. So I live and work in Rochester, New York. My name is Dan Hughes. I'm a professor of photography at the Rochester Institute of Technology. I was the webinar trainer for Nik Software from 2009 to 2013. And I've moved back to Rochester from California, where we were based. And I teach photography now. And I'm in my friend's basement studio to do our webinar. I'm an avid photographer. I'm a film photographer. I'm a digital photographer. I shoot video. I do a whole bunch of different things. My whole life sort of revolves around sort of image-based media, if you will. Photography, still photography, motion-based photography, taking film images, making them into something different with hybrid workflows and so on and so forth. And one of my favorite things to do is play with software. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, using Color Efex Pro, and right now talking about setting raw files up for different approaches using color effects. And all of these things are based around sort of nature photography. In this case, this isn't necessarily just a straight nature image. This is sort of nature reclaiming this old fireplace. This is the 200-year-old house that I grew up in as a boy, and my parents still live there up in northeastern New York. And this is a raw file shot with a Nikon camera, and it's a decent photograph in terms of capturing the full range of tones and colors. I'm gonna actually hide this so we've got a little bit more screen real estate. And what I want to talk to you about are kind of three different approaches to using raw processing software, whether it's Photolab or Adobe Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw from Photoshop or Capture One Pro or Affinity Pro. It doesn't really matter. These approaches will work no matter what raw processing software we're using. I've more and more used Photolab 3 because of some really cool features that I've grown very fond of for different processes. And I kind of break raw processing up into three categories. So for experimentation with color effects, you could do kind of minimal raw processing so that you're kind of taking whatever the camera gives you, and then you go into color effects. And it's an easy way to get a feel for what the filters do within Color Efex Pro, whereas the other two kind of processes that we'll talk about, you kind of have to know a little bit more of what you're after and then which filters to use, which again is what we're going to be talking about today. So one of the major approaches to raw processing is to do as much as you can in the raw processing software to make your image look to the final stage of what you want it to look like. In this case, the dynamic range of the scene is pretty well captured. If we look at the histogram in the upper right corner of our Photolab interface, the histogram looks fine, no problem with it right now. But I probably want to do a couple things to this image to kind of balance the image out. For example, some of the black or darker detail in the shadows, it's totally black, which is fine. That's what I want. And then the highlights in the sky are really quite bright. So, one of these approaches would be to go through your white balance adjustment. And in fact, let's close all of these down just for a second. For anyone not familiar with Photolab, this is Photolab 3. It's DxO's Photolab software, really fantastic raw processing software. And it's kind of broken into a tool set on the right side here with the essential tools, starting with white balance. And I'm okay with white balance. My screen looks pretty good right now. And we've got this really cool algorithm called DxO Smart Lighting. And what this is going to do is kind of help to open up shadow details and basically rebalance the tones of the image watch what happens. This is a cool tool. I wasn't going to really talk about this much, but might as well, right? So the DxO Smart Lighting tool, intensity is at 25% by default. If I take this slider to the right, watch two things. Watch the histogram in the upper right corner as the tones are compressed, and watch the highlights in the upper left corner of the image and sort of the shadow details throughout the photograph. As I increase this, what's happening, I've taken it way too far, but we've gotten all of this detail back in the highlights of the clouds, and then we started to open up some of the texture and detail in these shadows. And almost never am I going to recommend that you take your DxO Smart Lighting slider all the way up to 100, or for that matter, pretty much any slider all the way up to 100 for the most part, right? But one thing I do want you to get used to, if you're not already doing this, and I know we have a wide swath of people who are joining us for this webinar, from folks who are kind of brand new in image processing in the digital darkroom and to experts, right? But for everybody, you might as well take this intensity slider and slide it all the way up into the right, give it a second, see what it does, and then slide it all the way to the left. Even if you don't like any of what it's doing, whether it's from 0 to 25 or 10 or whatever, it gives you an opportunity to see the textures and details in the image itself. And it gives you an opportunity to see what this algorithm in this tool is specifically doing. And it's a great way to kind of say, oh, the DxO Smart Lighting is doing this. So when you go into something like selective tones or contrast adjustments, both on the right side of the interface here, you get a better idea as to how you can start to combine, the highlight slider with the blacks slider, and then pair that with DxO Smart Lighting, right? So the thought process of this raw processing tool is that you work basically from the top down, right? You start with something like white balance, go down into exposure compensation, DxO Smart Lighting, and then down through your essential tools. With one major kind of caveat, and that is within the color section here. And this goes again for any raw processing software. Most of them have the ability for you to adjust color profiles. And here within PhotoLab, it's called color rendering. And if you click into the color rendering section here, I have a piece of software called DxO Film Pack preloaded on my software here on my computer. And so this actually yields me more color rendering opportunities. But basically, if you click on your category here, you have different color rendering settings, profiles, that will do different things. In my case, I've got a whole bunch of color film and black and white film ICCs as well, or profiles that are generated, and then different ICC and DCP profiles. But this is a cool and interesting tool. And if you're not using PhotoLab, but you're in like Adobe Camera Raw or something, Adobe recently brought these profiles up to the top of the workflow, and kind of give users more of an opportunity to utilize these. And what they're doing is they're rendering the color initially through the raw processing that's occurring from when you take the image, import that information into a piece of software. There's a bunch of math, a bunch of stuff, if you will, going on to make your raw data into an image. And this color rendering, depending upon what you choose, you'll actually get a different system, a different way of rendering color, right? So this Leica Q is a much more contrasty color rendering than something like the actual camera that I shot this on, which I believe was a D800 or possibly a D810. Right, which looks more like this by its initial settings. And here's the thing: if we were to go back to those three sort of thought processes for raw processing, the minimal raw to stylize within Color Efex, and then the second one that we were just talking about, which is to get the image to look as close to how you want it to look in the final sort of process, to get as much work done in the raw processing as possible. And then there's the third system, which is, in my mind, to preserve as much information, preserve as much detail as you possibly can within the raw processing, to then go into something like Color Efex Pro to use it for its contrast algorithms and color control algorithms. In fact, what I want to do even though this image doesn't look as poppy or as nice and contrasty as it probably could using different color rendering intents, I'm going to use this this profile, the one that's specific to the D810, because I like that it's actually bringing out a lot of the detail inside of these shadows nicely. You know, it's rendering these textures really beautifully. You can actually see through the house as well. So if we zoom in a little bit, I'm zoomed into 160%, but you can actually see through the house from one to the other. And with that like a Q rendering, you couldn't see that. Those details just went really dark. So I'm going to try to preserve as much detail as I can. I think we're doing a good job here in the histogram. And the other one thing that I want to do here is go into my local adjustments. So in the upper right corner of Photolab, there's a bunch of different ways of doing local adjustments here within Photolab. And one of the reasons why I use Photolab as much as I do now is because there are control points built into the raw processing sort of portion of the workflow, which means it's non-destructive because I can always go back and I can re-edit these control points. But I'm going to go ahead and just click on one of these control points. We don't have too much time to talk about control points a whole lot here, but I'm just going to drop a control point into the sky and try and retain that texture. Maybe increase the micro contrast just a little bit. We'll take a gander at the before and after in just a second. And the other thing that I want to do is just see if we can get a little bit more texture and detail out of these dark shadows on the left. And I think we can get a lot, but if I take it too far, it's not going to look natural or clean or photographic at that point. We'll talk more about control points and how they're working when we get into Color Efex Pro. I'm going to just do one more control point. See, here's the problem with control points is then I see something that I want to adjust and I just go throw a control point on it. Each one of these control points within Photolab has contrast and tone adjustments, so exposure, contrast, micro contrast, clear view plus, which is like a texture adjustment, highlights, midtones, shadows, and blacks. And then it's broken into 3 different sort of topics or sections. So you've got the light adjustments, which we just covered. You've got the color adjustments, and then you've got a detail adjustment. And I'm just going to click on color really quickly. The color adjustments that you have here with control points in the raw processing allows you to do white balance adjustments actually using the white balance settings of those particular areas. And so that will blow the mind of certain people if you're interested, or if you shoot in dual illuminant situations, so like a place where let's say street photography outside or nature photography where there's 2 different illuminants, maybe moonlight and then also a street lamp or something like that. These 2 sliders allow you to control the white balance of particular areas based upon the selection that you're making with the control point. And so that's a huge deal. Anyways, let's close the selective or local adjustments. So I'm going to click the close button in the lower right corner. And let's move into Color Efex. So to launch Color Efex Pro 4 from Photolab, you click into the Nik Collection in the lower right corner. A little prompt pops up. This is your plugin selector. And we simply click on Color Efex Pro 4. And again, like as this launches, I know that there's some experts in here. I saw a few folks come in here who've been to lots of these webinars before. There's a bunch of folks in here who I assume have never used the software before. And so I want to kind of cover and make sure that everybody's going to get something out of this. More advanced users hopefully will get more advanced sort of techniques, and folks who are brand new to the software get an introduction as well as a little bit of information that hopefully helps them in their workflow. So that should have opened Color Efex. Yeah, apparently it went behind. And we're going to talk all about lots of parts of this interface. Right now, it opened up into the recipes section. I'm going to actually move into the left-hand side and click where it says filter library. So this is the filter library. I've got to actually look at my notes here and make sure I've got what I need. And in this case, I think I'm just going to use a recipe in this case, but the filter library here is the listing of all of your different filters that you've got built into the software. It's broken into different kinds of filters, from things like Pro Contrast, which is going to give us this really wonderful contrast control. And then you've got dynamic contrast slider as well, and a color correction if you had a color cast. I don't think we've got much of a color cast. So let's see what this one filter has done. Pro contrast, one of my favorite filters. I use this on any kind of photograph, let alone landscape, portrait work, still life, macro photography. All of the pro contrast filter is a really amazing tool. It's designed to try to optimize the contrast within the photo. And each of these filters has its own set of sliders, and then each of the filters has its own set of control points. So we saw control points within PhotoLab a minute ago. Those are called adjustment control points because those control points have, exposure, contrast, color adjustments, sharpening, and so on built into each individual control point. Here in Color Efex Pro, we have two kinds of control points. They only really do one thing though. The plus control point is going to put your filtered effect in an area, and the minus control point is going to remove the effect from an area. So if I click on the minus control point here on the right side, and I go and just drop my control point, like inside the shadow detail area or the shadow area of the old fireplace here, what this is doing is the control point is making a selection based upon what we put the point on. And since it's a minus control point, it's removing this filter effect. If I take a plus control point and I put it somewhere, it's going to add the full effect into that area. And just so that you can see what's happening here, I'm going to actually delete this control point up here in the top. You do that by just tapping the delete key on your keyboard to get rid of it when it's an active control point. So this point that's in the fireplace here, it's not active. If I click on it, now it's active because you can see it's sort of highlighted in gold or in orange. And then you can see your size, your area of influence slider. And then this second slider here within Color Efex is an opacity slider, which is the strength of the filtered effect. When the opacity is down at 0, you're not putting any of that particular filter in. If you slide your opacity slider up to 100, you're putting all of the effect in. And you can choose anywhere in between, 0 to 100. Now, if you're wondering how the control point is making its selection, and you're wondering where the selection actually is, if you follow me to the right side of the interface, and we click on this little expand collapse box. It's a little triangle here, and you click on it. This is going to open up into a full filter opacity slider, which I'll show you later, and then also a control point list. So if I had several control points listed out here, they would be here, and you'd be able to turn them on and off, and you'd be able to view a couple different things. The most important thing right now is if you follow me to the right side of the control points list and you click on this little checkbox, this is going to show you your selection. And actually what it's showing you is where the filter is applied and where the filter is not applied. And that's in this case because of this control point. In fact, if I click on this control point and I start dragging it around, you'll see the selection actually instantaneously change, like right in front of your eyes. It's pretty incredible. And what the control point's doing is basing its selection wherever you put the point on the tone, color, and texture, as well as the size of the area that you've given it around the area of influence, right? And so what you're seeing here is anything that has white, it has the full pro contrast effect or filtered effect on it. Anything that's black has none of it, and then anything that's some shade of gray has some of it. The darker the gray, the less this filter is affecting. So right now it's doing a good job to remove the filter effect from inside of the fireplace, and it's also making this really nice photographic looking selection. So if we were to toggle the effect on and off, you wouldn't see any obvious masking sort of problems or artifacts or anything like that, because the filter or the control points specifically want to make a very clean photographic looking selection. Now, what I just did is I took a plus control point. So from the right side here, click on the plus control point, and I placed it on the little weed that was sort of growing there. And by placing the control point on that little weed, what we're saying is that we want the pro contrast applied here, and we want the minus control points selection to get more refined. Because the more control points I add, the more the control points kind of understand what they should and what they shouldn't be affecting based upon where you place the point. Now, I never get too well, I shouldn't say that. I rarely get really specific using these control point masks, because what I'm typically more concerned with is just where the filter is and where it's not based upon what I can see. And sometimes you don't want to do that. You need to be as precise as you possibly can be. But because the control point's selective capability is so clean and photographic looking, I don't pay that much attention to those masks very often, because I just say, okay, that looks good. My histogram still does what it needs to do. And so I'm happy with it. For the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and click the Save button. We've only talked about one filter so far. And usually I would actually add more than one filter into a filter stack, but let's keep moving here because we've been talking for 20 minutes or so and we've only looked at one picture so far. And we've got all sorts of pictures to be looking at. So let's actually move into sort of the next section here, and that is, let's talk about some of my favorite filter combinations. Now that we've kind of gotten a look at raw processing and a short look at how the interface works within Color Efex Pro, I'll toggle my tools back on, which here in Photolab, if I just hit the Tab key, which is a nice little shortcut, Adobe actually has the same shortcut. If you hit the Tab key on your keyboard, it'll hide the tools palettes. Actually, the Nik Collection will do that as well. And what we're going to do is start with this nice bird photo. This is a photograph that my good friend Lori Rubin shot, really beautiful image. And we're going to jump into Color Efex, but I want to just show you something that it might be interesting or fun and completely false and fake. And that is, if I click into the local adjustments, and I point this out because I want to show you how this system works. And then also I've seen birding images that have been falsely adjusted recently to try to make it look like birds are not really the kinds of birds that they are. And I probably shouldn't even show this trick, but basically, if I go into my Hughes slider in my control points, I can start to change the color of the bird. So now we have a magenta bird, right? And if I then shift its color temperature, and then maybe even move this over, and then all I need to do is sort of cover the rest of the bird with the control points. And now, instead of having this nice deep blue bird, we're creating this new fake pink bird for Easter or something. And like the control points do this basically by themselves. I had to make the adjustment, but the control point is making the selection for us. And it's such a clean, photographic looking selection that it becomes quite believable. As I go and I lighten this bird's eye up a little bit. All right, just to see the before and after. There's the before. There's the after. I'm seeing some issues with these control points. I probably want to get rid of the effect that's down on his or her talons and foot there. But anyways, I'm going to get rid of all of that stuff. Let's reset it. And let's just take this image as it is right into Color Efex. So I'll click into the Nik Collection in the lower right corner, clicking into Color Efex Pro. And what happens when you use Color Efex from Photolab or from Adobe Lightroom, basically you have your raw image. You would do all of your raw processing first to your image, and then go into the Nik plugins, and it's going to make a copy of your original photo. So you're never working on the raw file. You're always working from a duplicate file. And then in this case, we've got our nice lively bird. And I want to give you a combination of some of my favorite filters for nature photography specifically. And one of them you will be completely surprised by, I think, right off the bat. And it's a combo of bleach bypass with detail extractor in dark and light and center, but used in a subtle way that just sort of directs your eye as the viewer through the image, right? Because we have these filters that are highly transformative, kind of like bleach bypass or detail extractor. Both of these filters, but by default, are hugely transformative. But you don't have to work with them that way. And that's one of the sort of thought processes that I would like to inspire you to, if you haven't already started to play with these filters in this way. Bleach bypass has this really cool way of directing the viewer's attention. And we can do it selectively so that we direct your attention, your eye, into the higher saturated areas, the higher contrasted areas, and the places with more texture, right? So it works really nicely in this image because we've got this super short depth of field in our photograph, and I can pretty easily direct your eye towards the subject. What I've done is I've zeroed out my brightness, I've zeroed out the saturation, I brought the contrast to be as low as I can, and I'm actually going to just increase the local contrast a little bit, maybe 13, 14%. And then rather than leaving the application of bleach bypass on the whole image, we're going to take a plus control point and we're just going to place it right on the bird. And so I'll probably end up actually removing some of this effect from the bird because I think it's still a little strong, a little heavy-handed. But for viewing purposes, I'm going to click into the upper left corner. We'll click on the split preview. And this is going to cut the image right down the middle. On the left is the original. On the right is the enhanced. And if I slide this, there's the before and there's the after, right? And so we've got just this little bit of texture, this little bit of localized contrast just applied on the bird. And actually we can check that. So we can make sure that we're just applying the effect on the bird, again, by moving into the control points. So click on the word control points here. All of the control points that we've added on the bird are here listed out for us. And if I, instead of clicking on the individual box that's on the far right, and we click on this little box that has a little circle in it, it'll actually show you where the effect is being applied and where it's not, right? So this is turning on all of the control points instead of just the one control point like what we did before. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and kind of place some minus control points in the areas that are being affected that we don't want affected. So a nice little shortcut to learn as well is Shift Command A, and that's going to yield a new control point for us. But the new control point is apparently it's a plus control point, so I don't want that. I'm going to remove it. So now all I've done is I've placed some control points outside of the bird. They are minus control points, and I've done that with the intention of wanting to remove the bleach bypass filter. Again, just for demonstration purposes, if I increase the contrast and I increase local contrast, you can see exactly where we've got the application of the filter. I just want to be really, really subtle in this case, so I can draw your attention into the area that I'm interested in you looking. Right, so that's one of the intentions of making a strongly composed image, is you're trying to direct the viewer's attention through the photograph. Even more so is to take these digital tools and to be able to control the viewer's attention in another way, in doing it with controlled post-processing. If you've got a good exposure and a strong image with good content, this stuff is easy because you've already got a good photograph. All you've got to do is some subtle little tweaks here and there to really direct the viewer's attention through the image. In this case, we've used bleach bypass. Here's the detail extractor filter. Its intention is literally to extract details from the shadows and details from the highlight areas. In this case, I love what it does to this bird's little eye here. In fact, I'm going to just place a plus control point. We're going to zoom in to 100%. So if you follow me to the upper right corner of the interface, I'm going to click on this drop down or pop-up menu, zoom into 100% so I get a better idea of what's happening with this singular control point. And then I'm going to move over into my detail extractor slider, and I'm going to start to increase my detail extraction until I'm happy with the application. In fact, it's, again, a pretty subtle little effect, but if we look at the before and after, here's the before, there's the after. I prefer the contrast range of the before, but I like the detail that we're getting out of the eye. So to kind of solve this, I'm going to take a minus control point, and I'm going to place that minus control point just near the beak of the bird here. And so now if we look at the before and after, we've very quickly just selected out those important parts that I want to direct your attention towards. Toggling that on and off shows you the before and after. I can see I'm affecting the bird's shoulder a little bit as well, so I'll just take a little minus control point, place it over here. All right, to finish this one off, and I would say, like, I am going a little bit heavy-handed on these processes just to show you kind of what's happening. And I want to show you one more heavy-handed process, and that's using a filter called Darken, Lighten, Center 2 times. This filter, in fact, if you follow me to the left-hand side of the interface here, a lot of my favorite filters, I have actually favorited, if you will. If you click on the little star that's to the left of the label of the filter, it will star that, it will favorite it for you, and you can see some of my favorite filters. So bleach bypass, brilliance and warmth, cross processing, dark and light and center, film effects modern branded, and we're going to talk more about all of them, all of those favorite filters, because that's what we're doing today. But it's a good way to kind of call out your favorite filters. And actually, if you wanted to organize your favorite filters in your filter library, instead of being on the All tab, we could move into that upper left corner, click on favorites, and then you can see at least my favorites right now. I tend to stick to the All. And actually, I'm going to show you a different way of organizing these tabs. And it's a really nice way of thinking about choosing filters as well. Instead of thinking about them specifically for a kind of photography, we'll take a look at a different approach. All right, I'm really jumping around here. So let's reset. We're going to go to dark and light and center. Let's see what this does by default. It's basically a magic trick, right? It directs your attention towards the center of the image by lightening the center and darkening the border. And I want to replace my center point, so I'm directing your attention a little bit up out of the center from the actual center of the frame. So I've clicked the place center button on the right side of the interface, and then I clicked on the new center, which is sort of closer to the bird's head. And then I'm going to take my border luminosity all the way down to -100, and I'm going to leave the center luminosity at 25. But the trick here is we're going to actually add another version of dark and light and center, because you can have more than one application of a filter. And in fact, if you're going to work selectively, like with that bleach bypass filter or detail extractor, sometimes it's a good idea to actually have two applications of the same filter on the image and then put control points exactly where you want them to be to get the exact representation that you're interested in. Now back to dark and light and center. So we've applied our second version. I'm going to move into my shape, and I'm going to click on the oval shape. I'm going to leave my center luminosity at 25, and I'm going to actually take my border luminosity down a little bit more. The center size, just so that you can see what it's doing, set to 0. It makes the center of your dark and light and center very, very small. If you slide this center size up, it basically makes the center expand out further towards the borders of the image. And this is a totally subjective thing as to how far or how far in you want to take it. But what we've basically done here is relit the image, right? We've used contrast with bleach bypass and detail extractor to get a little bit more texture out of the bird. And then we used two applications of dark and light and center to really direct your attention towards the bird itself. And if we take a look at the before and after using the compare button in the upper left corner, this is the original image. And then here's the enhanced image. And like I said, for the webinar, I think I'm pushing them a little further than I probably would go if I were to make a print of this. I think this would probably look pretty good on the web. If someone's going to look at this on their phone through Instagram or a website or something, it's probably good. I think in print, we might need to think about the applications of these things a little bit differently. But here's the before, there's the after. I'm happy with that combination. I'm going to click the save button in the lower right corner, and we're going to keep moving. So let's actually jump over into Photoshop. I've got a couple images open in Photoshop already. So we're over here in Photoshop. This is the Nik selective tool. It's one of the ways that you access the Nik collection here in Photoshop. I do actually like using the software quite a bit from Photoshop for a whole bunch of different processes and a whole bunch of different reasons. And rather than me showing you the entire workflow, I'm just going to show you this sort of stack of layers here to think about this image processing. The first thing that's a little bit funky about this image is I expanded the canvas out because I knew I wanted to have an image border, but I didn't want the original composition to get cut into. The image border is a filter within Color Efex Pro, which is black and white conversion software from the Nik suite, as well as one of the filters in Color Efex Pro. And so in Photoshop, what I was able to do is actually expand the canvas so that my white background ends up going completely white, and then I've got a little bit more sort of space or room around the image for the cactus to kind of stretch out. I like the gesture of this one. So that's what I'm running with. But to talk about my process here in Photoshop, I used the raw pre-sharpener because I liked what it did with the textures of this particular image. I used a filter called the detail extractor, which we took a look at. And then actually with this detail extractor layer, I used a tool within Photoshop called Liquify. And I did that to kind of amplify or to change the gesture of the cactus. So you can see a tonal change, and then you can also see some of those pixels shift. I then whited out the background just using a curve and a selection. Then I converted it from color to black and white. And then I just applied a last filter using image borders. And technically I actually could have put an image border on using the silver effects layer. But this is a process that I've done and will do from time to time, depending upon my image and what my goal is. And the beauty of using the Nik collection from Photoshop is that you have layers, layer masks, blending modes, and then smart objects if you use smart objects. And I just wanted to show you that process. It's just a different way of thinking about approaching these things. So I'm going to not save that. And we'll jump into this next photograph. So the original raw file was processed using Photolab, and then I brought it from Photolab over here into Photoshop. I cloned out the upper left corner. There's another zebra up there. And I did some processing and said, that just is distracting up there. So I got rid of them. And then we use Color Efex Pro to do something like this. This is another highly transformed image, obviously, but I think it works well. And it's a kind of an interesting filter combination. So let's take a look at how we do it. First things first, we go into Color Efex Pro. And we're going to use a filter called Monday Morning, which is another one of those stylistic filters that's highly stylized. I'm going to click the tab or hit the tab button. It's going to give us our tools palette back. And we're going to use Monday Morning. And Monday Morning, like I said, highly stylized filtered effect, right? But we don't have to leave it that way because we can move into the tools palette itself. I'm going to reduce the grain because I don't want any grain added in. I'm actually going to, I probably will end up bringing the brightness up a little bit because if I bring it down to 0, well, it's kind of nice. It's just a little bit dark. Bring the smear down, which is a blurring effect. It's kind of like a glow, but it reduces the contrast quite a bit. In this case, don't want to do that. And I'm going to increase the color back up to about 80, maybe 90. What the heck? Let's see what happens at 100. No, let's do 100. Let's just look at the before and after using Monday Morning this way. So it kind of takes this higher key image. Let's open up the histogram. It's a gray image. The dynamic range of the scene is relatively low, right? It looks like it was kind of a cloudy day probably when Lori shot this one. And what we're doing is we're adding some contrast. You can see the highlights get brighter, but the whole rest of the image has this sort of darker, ethereal kind of glowing effect to it. I am going to increase the brightness just a little bit, maybe 5%, 6%. And then I'm going to click the Add Filter button. So when we finish up with Monday Morning or with whatever filter we're using, you click the Add Filter button. Move over to the left side, and in this case, we're going to use another one of the sort of highly stylized filters called Film Effects Nostalgic. In fact, there are 4 different film effects filters here, and they all have the basic premise behind them is to transform the image into a faded image or to emulate a contemporary film stock. In fact, the film stocks, the sort of contemporary, the ones that maybe you shoot with still or used to shoot with maybe, are the Film Effects Modern branded. And then the rest of them, Film Effects Faded, Film Effects Vintage, and Film Effects Nostalgic, do something like this, right? So this is supposed to feel like film, even though I don't think there are any real film types. Maybe some of the new Lomo-based films would do something like this. But we're really going to mess around with these sliders a whole bunch. And this is what I want you to get used to if you're not doing this. I'm going to use film type number 12. So I'm going to click on that drop-down menu, bring that all the way down to film type number 12. I'm going to bring my film strength up to 100. I don't think I'm going to leave it there. Grain per pixel, I'm going to bring it all the way to the right so that there are 500 grain per pixel. It's basically the smallest grain possible. If I bring this over to 1 grain per pixel, you can see what it does. It adds like a film grain effect back into the photo. I'm going to bring the vignette down to 0, the glow down to 0, and a perceptual saturation I'm going to bring down to like 50, and brightness, let's see what happens if I bring it down to 0. And my idea here, or my thought process as to how am I deciding where to put these sliders, is I want to basically zero these out. I know I want this film effect, but I don't want my brightness or glow to really be affected because I just kind of did that stuff with Monday morning. So if we look at the before and after with the Film Efex Nostalgic, we went from that kind of soft, glowy, modern Monday morning look to here where we've got like a highly or more highly stylized sort of colorization because of this film kind of effect. I'm going to reduce my film strength. If I bring it down to 0, I'm not going to get any. But here's the beauty. You can decide how far up you want to bring it. And then two things that are happening now that I've added my Film Efex Nostalgic. Let's take a look with it before and after. I'm losing some more detail. I think I'm actually losing most of my detail that I want in Monday morning, but I'm losing a little bit more from Film Efex Nostalgic. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to move back into my Monday morning filter, and I'm just going to take a minus control point. I'm going to remove Monday morning from the zebra's nose here, at least mostly. And then I'm going to remove my Monday morning filter from the mane of the other zebra. And the reason I want to do that is because now that I've added my Film Efex Modern in, or Film Efex Nostalgic rather, it was blocking up all of those details. It was all black. And I want there to be some texture and some detail in there. From here, one more weird filter, right? And so, you know, the other images that we looked at, we're kind of using some standard filters that I think everybody's going to get used to. Darken, lighten, center, detail extractor, maybe the bleach bypass is a weird one for folks who've never maybe tried that out. In this case, this whole filter stack is a bunch of sort of more esoteric filters. The next one we're going to use is actually the infrared film filter. And I use this constantly. In fact, I use this exact technique pretty often where I use infrared film, but I put it specifically on method number 2, which is going to give me this this like glowing effect that the lack of anti-halation backing that was on certain infrared films, most infrared films, would give you. So we're emulating an infrared film here, but my concept here is we're going to actually get all of the color back. But what I want to do is sort of create a nice glowing effect while it's in black and white. And then here's the trick, and this is a beautiful, wonderful trick that you can use for all sorts of different filter applications. If you click on the words control points, there's an opacity slider, and the opacity slider is the opacity of the overall filter. If I bring it down to 0, I get none of that infrared film. If it's up at 100, I get the entire application. Well, I can slide that opacity slider anywhere I want in between. And so what I find myself doing is applying it almost exactly like this, these settings, definitely method number 2, that's my favorite one. Light and highlights pretty up, you know, up pretty high. Brightness and contrast is going to be adjusted based upon the image. And then the opacity slider is based entirely on how much color I want and then how much glow. It's like the ratio of glowing effect from the infrared film to the color. So in this case, I like about 18%. If we take a look at the before and after by clicking the checkbox on and off, there's the before, there's the after, sort of bleaching the color a little, but now we have this softer effect. And then what the heck, let's just go ahead and finish this one off. Since our subject matter is directly in the center of the image, let's use darken, light, and center. We're going to click into the different shape. I'm going to increase the size, and I'm actually going to not take my center luminosity up so bright. We'll just darken down the border. I'm going to hit Tab on my keyboard. And then this time, we're not going to use the split preview, we'll use a side-by-side preview. And you can see the original image on top and then our enhanced image on the bottom. And let's say you like all of those effects, except the film effects nostalgic is a strange one. It's definitely very different, and it is pretty transformative in terms of the color. We could just turn that off, and now we have a much more sort of natural photographic color than when the thing is on with the film effects nostalgic. I want to talk a little bit about creating your own approach for combining these filters together. And honestly, the more you play in here, the more you play around with the filters, adjust the opacity here and there, use control points to direct the viewer's attention through the image, the more you're going to get out of the software, first of all, the more familiar you're going to get with each of the individual filters, obviously, and then you're going to be able to create your own different kinds of approaches based upon the different kinds of images that you're working with. So this photograph, it's from the Great Salt Lake, right outside of Salt Lake City. I was with my family. Actually, my wife has this image hung up on her wall in her office, except what I did was I took an audio recording of her cat, Jeep, and then I actually adjusted the mountain range based upon the audio recording of the cat meowing, which is interesting. And I don't have the version on this computer, otherwise I'd show you, but it ended up being pretty cool. And it's this nice nod to a vacation that we went on and her cat at the same time. So let's click into Color Efex. We've got our Salt Lake panoramic. There's a couple of things that I want to show you here within Color Efex that we haven't talked about at all. And that is, we've talked a good amount about the filter library. And I mentioned the fact that you can actually change these tabs, right? Right now they're set to all, and then film, wedding, architecture, travel, portrait, and so on and so forth. But you can customize that. And you do that by moving into the settings button that's in the lower left corner of the interface. And in settings, if you go to filter list settings, the bottom option here, you can choose your categories. And so I'm going to go from the film category 1, and I'm going to change this to color. I'm going to go to category 2, I'm going to change it to contrast. Category 3 to detail. And then category 4, I don't know if I'll switch it to glass, but just so that you know what these are any of the filters that would emulate glass filters that you'd put over your lens. The softening filters would be the ones that would kind of include a blurring effect. I'm going to say stylizing, though. I'm going to set that to stylizing. Category 5, let's say the updated. So those are the filters that were changed from one version to the next. And then I don't really care about the last one in this case. So I'm actually going to put it on nature because that's what our webinar is about. So I'm going to click OK. And then nothing happens, right? But nothing happens because I just changed the setting, and I have to actually click cancel and then open back up into Color Efex for that to take place. As that launches, you'll notice the filter library tabs are now listed out in a different way. And I personally, when I'm approaching images, there's a whole bunch of different uses of the photos that I make anyways. A lot of them are made for webinar purposes, for demonstration purposes, but I also have a couple ongoing bodies of work. And I don't think of those ongoing bodies of work as portraiture, as nature, as landscape, as still life, and so on. I think of them as having a relationship between all of those different kinds or genres of photography. But when I'm doing my post-processing, even if an image is included in my hypermagnification project, for example, I don't think about it as primarily macro photography work. I think about doing the post-processing and adjusting for color, or adjusting for contrast, or adjusting for detail. And so it's a different approach to thinking about these filters than approaching by way of nature, or by way of portraits, or by way of landscape, and so on. And so all of these color filters, when I click on the color tab, all of these filters are the ones that are primarily based around adjusting color. When I click into detail, these are the 4 filters that are primarily based around adjusting textures of details. It's specifically increasing textures and details as opposed to blurring or softening. Contrast, those are the contrast specific, and then the stylizing. So it's just a different way of thinking about approaching these filters. Another different way of thinking about approaching the filters is to use recipes. And in fact, there are a bunch of recipes that are built into the software. Actually, there's 10 that are sample recipes that are built in. And then there are 10 newish en vogue recipes. And I actually built these recipes for DxO, for Nik software. And I did that using the approach that we're talking about today. Right, and so Blue Monday, this is not a standard combination of filters that I would use, but if I'm using Photo Stylizer, I'm oftentimes also playing with cross-processing. And then if I'm using 2 color adjustment filters, I probably also need to make some sort of contrast adjustment. So that's why contrast only is also applied with these 2 color tools. Clarity Bump, this other en vogue recipe, is a subtle adjustment tool, and it's using a very common combination in my own workflow: tonal contrast, brilliance and warmth, and pro contrast. And you can turn these on and off, and you can see what each one is doing. So tonal contrast, a little bit of texture there. And what I would do is turn these off, go into tonal contrast, make the adjustments as I see fit, maybe increase the midtone, decrease the highlight contrast. In fact, if you really decrease the highlight contrast here, we get a little bit more detail out of the sky. And then maybe move into brilliance and warmth. Click on that, use it, and then pro contrast. In this case, though, I have a filter stack that I wanted to develop for this image to show you. But I wanted to show you these recipes. There's actually other recipes that I used to put them out when I was on Google+. I would share them for free. Those are probably gone. They're probably not available anymore because Google+ isn't available anymore. But folks share these recipes all of the time. You can create your own. You can export them. You can save them yourself. These en vogue ones are built in. But if I go into my custom recipes, here's my representation of Lomo red scale film, right? And so that's actually a combination of filters: infrared film, film effects modern, colorize, and photo stylizer to try and copy that film stock. But if I wanted to like share this with you, I could scroll over my recipe, click on this button, and export the recipe, and then put it wherever. It's a very small metadata file that actually gets sucked into Color Efex Pro when you load it, and then just sits there as a recipe. It's a really nice way of working. I'm actually going to just get rid of all of these filters because we're running out of time here. I always have way more stuff to talk about in the allotted time than I get to. So I'm going to move quickly. So let's use Pro Contrast. I know I'm going to use the Pro Contrast filter in this case, and I just want to subtly increase the contrast. Too much dynamic contrast. And the thing is like we've done some really transformative filter effects so far. We haven't done too many sort of subtle effects. And that's what we're going to do here using, actually, I want contrast color range. So I'll go into contrast color range. And just to describe this filter, it allows you to basically call out a particular portion of the color spectrum and then adjust the contrasts of that color area. So in this case, we're going to do 2 applications of the contrast color range filter. And in this case, I'm going to focus only on this orange area in the beach. I'm going to bring my overall contrast down to 0. Let's increase the color contrast, about right to there, 78%. And then we just apply it selectively. Let's place our plus control points here. I'm going to add another one. Let's add contrast color range. Again, this time we're going to go after an aqua color. So I'm going to take my color setting. I'm going to slide that over towards aqua. Or this sort of like green color, bluish green. Let's bring the contrast all the way down. Again, I'm going to put my plus control point down here in the foreground. And so now what I'm doing, or my thought process in this case, as I take some minus control points to remove from this highlight area, my idea here is that I need to create a kind of base for your eye. I need you to be able to be grounded in the bottom of the picture in a way, because in the original exposure, the whole image is a little bit flat. It's kind of suffering from like flare, and it's a very low contrast scene as well. And so I've added some contrast with Pro Contrast, obviously, but I also needed to add a little bit extra down in here. And by being able to call out the particular colors that we're affecting by contrast color range, and then adding control points to do it more specifically, I've got even more control. And in fact, we're going to finish this image off with Film Effects Modern, and we're going to use the Agfa Precisia 100, Precisia. I don't know how to pronounce that one. I actually created this film effect as well for DxO, but I don't know how to pronounce the actual film type. Maybe somebody can type that in. Anyways, long story short, we're up on our time. Let's just take one quick look at our before and after. Here's the before, here's the after.